Hi, welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm Casey Scott, your host. My guest today is addictions counselor Roget Lockard. Roget, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Casey.
We've been having a series of conversations on the nature of addiction. I think this is our 16th conversation.
Wow.
Amazing. Now, when we concluded last time, Roget, we were talking about the spiritual benefits of step 10. And it occurs to me that that leads us very naturally into discussion of step 11, which is very deeply involved with spirituality. Mm-hmm. But you made an interesting observation off camera about that too, about how one step leads to another. So would you like to just talk about that for a minute before we go on?
Yeah, well, we've talked about that off and on, I think, during this series, the way there's a flow both from one step to the next, and how each step sets up the step that follows it, but also derives from the step that precedes it. And having that in mind really helps illuminate the steps as one is engaging with them in more ways than one. So, you know, my thought du jour doesn't exhaust the possibilities of that principle, but what I note is the feel of the 10th step, which, while in its ideal manifestation, and that's the one about taking a daily inventory, in case people have...
When we are wrong, promptly admitted.
Right.
Yes.
And in the off chance that people haven't memorized every detail of our of our exchange, that doing that sort of gathers oneself at the end of the day, which is sort of a logical and a commonplace time to do the 10th step process. It brings us into this moment, and in this moment is where the 11th step has its starting off point, jumping off point.
Yes.
Do you want me to quote the 11th step?
I just want to observe that what I noted in the language of the 10th step was that it sort of requires us to be in the moment at all times, or ideally.
Encourages it, certainly.
And not that we're ever going to achieve that, but it really points us in that direction, which is very, I mean, that's sort of a solid basis for spirituality and pretty much any discipline, I think.
Well, I know the first time I fell in love with that orientation, that core perception, was Ram Dass's "Be Here Now," and you know, truly an inspired title. And more recently, of course, there's Eckhart Tolle's "The Power of Now," and I find both of those, in their rather different ways and different styles, to be fundamentally sound and inspirational in the rich sense of that word, inspire.
Okay, well, let me just read the 11th step here. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. So this strikes me as at once the most reassuring thing that we've encountered so far, but also at the same time the most challenging.
How most reassuring?
Well, most reassuring in that it's sort of it gives us a place, sort of a place to live. That there's this sort of I'm sort of going back to my Baptist origins now, but there is this home in this step, That while an individual interpretation might feel that it's, and I think this is where it's challenging also, but that if I'm not quite sure exactly how to phrase this, but if I'm acting in accordance with God's will, then I'm obeying all the rules, right? And the tone of the step is a little bit different than that.
Maybe even a lot different.
Maybe even a lot different.
Yeah.
But that's where I think that the challenge, I mean, at least for me, that's a lot of where the challenge comes in. And then there's also the stumbling block of the second step and the third step. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and then made that decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care. And that flies in the face of the addict's desire to be in control.
Well, I would say it goes beyond desire. The addict's perception that control is an existential necessity. Mm-hmm. And that to fail to be in control adequately is to become obliterated. Mm-hmm. Parenthetically, I just want to say that your evocative remarks about alluding to your Baptist origins and the idea of seeing the 11th step as something that sort of took you in, mm-hmm. or words to that effect, yes. Reminded me of a place that I went back in the early 80s, the Omega Institute, mm-hmm. which had its first program, I'm pretty sure, first summer of programs at a place in or near New Lebanon, New York, that was a Sufi community.
Really?
And the name of the community was the Abode of the Message. And it occurs to me that, in a certain sense, perhaps the 11th step might be seen as the abode of the message. Because the message, in effect, being, okay, now that you have, as we've talked about in the latter part of this series, you have made a substantial acquaintanceship with yourself in the first 6 steps. Who am I? Mm-hmm. And you're now investing more and more consciously and conscientiously in being more faithful to that. By the time we get to the 11th step, we're just kind of holding still and striving to open up more and more to, frankly, to throw, to do a spoiler here. I think the thing that we discover is that this idea that we are separate from God is the fundamental fallacy. Mm. And so God's will for me is not, in fact, at conflict with what I most deeply yearn for. And indeed, the yearning that sent me off on my addictive trajectory way back when. And that the 11th step is a step that offers to take us closer and closer to that realization if we don't get distracted by the idea that it's about the rules. Mm. If we don't get us distracted by the idea that it's about a higher power who wishes for us to be good and sacrifice ourselves for his glorification, or whatever, that it has to be him or us, mm-hmm. in some sense. That if he wins, it feels like we lose. Of course, I'm ramping along, assigning gender to higher power, which for me is just essentially amusing.
Well, the thing You see in my inability to be as articulate about this as I have other steps that I think the part of the issue here is that the book. I noticed in the description of this step in the book Alcoholics Anonymous that there is a procedure that is laid out how you do this step.
A recommended suggestion.
Yes, but it is a very intimate, personal thing, and we've really I think we've stepped into a new realm here.
New in what sense?
Well, I think it's that phrase, conscious contact. That now we're seeking to have conscious contact with this guidance, whatever it is. I have no idea who or what God is, and I know that I don't want to get into that kind of discussion. I don't think it's fruitful. But there is now, it's not theoretical now. Now we're into a realm where it's real, practical, and we're going to put it to use.
It is both transcendent and utilitarian. And it can be either of those emphatically, or both of them together in perhaps the most sublime manifestations. But you're right, as usual, the AA Big Book tends to give something that could sound like a template of instructions. It's worth recalling that the other principal source of original material on the 12 Steps, which we've talked about plenty of times before, is the book called 12 and 12, the 12 Steps and the 12 Traditions. And by and large, what I find is that in the 20 intervening years between when the Big Book was written and the 12 and 12 was written, with the added experience of more years of sobriety for the founders and more members with a lot of years of sobriety, the recognition that there are indeed many, my father's house has many mansions and in many pathways to those mansions. And one of my favorite parts in any of the AA literature is a section from the 11th step in the 12 and 12 that says, I'm paraphrasing, there are times when we find ourselves taken with a resistance so strong that we can only pray with the greatest of difficulty. And then there are times when it's even worse than that, and we cannot bring ourselves to pray at all. When we're confronted with times like this, and here's where in the normal text, religious text, you will hear something like, we need to buckle down and do God's work and do what we know to be good for us.
Be a good soldier. Yeah.
It doesn't say that. It says we should not be too hard on ourselves. All of us, at one point it says, all of us at some time are taken with a sickening resistance. And we should not be too hard on ourselves. We should simply resume prayer as soon as we find ourselves able. And that gentleness, that, yeah, of course, this is going to happen. It happens to all of us. And come back as soon as you can, because actually it feels better. And that's the great puzzle, because everyone I know who says, yes, I believe I have had some experience aligning myself with God's will, with divine, whatever we want to call it, reports that is a freeing, uplifting, luminescent experience. So the persistent puzzle is, so why then do we let it lapse?
Why the resistance?
Why the resistance, or whatever it is that prompts us to relinquish this this opening up. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded of something we mentioned off camera before this show. Is it Mary Lou Williamson, I believe, who talks about who's, I think, fairly famous for a quote to the effect that she believes that we're not so much afraid of failing to become who we really could be, our best possibility. We're really afraid of becoming that, of manifesting that.
Yeah, that's a very sobering thought. I want to ask you about the word only in this step, because that, again, I think that may be a place where a lot of resistance comes from. Mm-hmm. So can you give us a little perspective on that?
Well, I can give you two perspectives that may seem at cross purposes. One is sympathy with the people who experience resistance, because I could well imagine myself among them. If only refers to the idea that there's God's will for me, and then there's what would be most enjoyable and gratifying and fulfilling, that word, for me. And no, I have to choose God's will over that. So, frankly, in conversations with clients and other people who I may be talking with about the sobriety journey, they will, for example, say, well, I've been told that I'm not supposed to pray for things that I want. I'm just supposed to pray for knowledge of God's will and power to carry that out. And I say, at the risk of inviting a thunderbolt, I'm really in favor of encouraging people to pray for what they want for a cluster of reasons, not the least of which is it prompts us to really think about what it is that we want and what that wanting consists of. And frequently I hear stories of people who start to pray for something and then, oh, wait a second, is this what I really want to enlist divine power for help with? And I'm reminded, I think I mentioned to you Mark Twain's marvelous quote. I think it's Huck Finn or rather Tom Sawyer, who says, "You can't pray a lie."
Yeah.
It tends to take us into what is really true inside ourselves. But the other thing is, I remember somebody saying, all of my prayers are answered. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no, and sometimes it's not now. And so if we kind of adopt that stance, it's like, it's not possible to make a wrong prayer if we bring a certain kind of willing attention to, is it being answered or not? And if not, if it feels like it's not being answered, how can I understand that?
There's a phrase somewhere that I encountered in one of your writings, but it comes from this book, and that is self-will run riot. And this is so. I mean, that's a description of the active addict alcoholic, and it's a very good description.
Oh, brilliant!
And this is so counter to that, what we're talking about. We've come a very long way from that.
Right. 11 steps.
11 steps.
Yeah.
But it also, while it's counter to that, it brings us back to the same issues that we started with, as you pointed out earlier. That we're dealing with those fundamental longings that our willfulness in pursuit of what we believe to be a satisfying fulfillment of those longings has put us in this predicament. And now we have another way to approach that fundamental problem.
And I'm sure we've touched on it a number of times, but maybe the most succinct way that I know to distinguish between those two, because it's all about will. We don't lose our will. It's about reorienting the manifestation of will from willful, which is marvelously descriptive, inflated with will, to willing. A state of willingness that's receptive, that and I think that's a great deal of what the 11th step is talking about. I remember a friend of mine, an AA member, who said, you know, shortly after I got into AA, I found myself, to my own surprise, quite receptive to prayer as a routine practice. And he said, but I was at a meeting one time after I'd been a member for about 5 years, and I noticed that in most meetings I heard people say something about getting on their knees and praying. And I realized, I thought about it, and I said, you know, I don't believe I've ever done that. And he said, that's probably not coincidence. So he said, well, I'll give it a try, because he hadn't made a vow that no way I'm getting on my knees. The next time he had an opportunity at home or wherever he was, he got on his knees, and he said it felt completely different. And for me, it's that gesture of willingness. It's simply putting the body in a place, not of subservience, but of simply, okay, this isn't about my will being in charge. This is about me settling in here in the everythingness of it all, and being receptive and prayerful.
Humility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could call it a spiritual awakening. Step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So is this the description of a sober life? Is that what that is?
Well, it certainly alludes to it. I don't know if it describes it in detail, but it sums it up. As you are probably well aware, the 12th step tends to get, in practice or in conversation from many folks in AA, the 12th step, which is really the three parts that you just read, having had a spiritual awakening, carry the message, and practice the principles, tends to get boiled down to just one, the carrying the message part. And I think that's unfortunate. I think everyone is being shortchanged in that rendering of it. For myself, I think of it almost the exact opposite. And it has everything to do with what you just said, the sober, what is the sober life? I call the 12th step the magic sandwich. Have I mentioned this to you?
I believe you have, but give it to us again.
Yeah. That if we have the three parts, bread, meat, bread, the first part is having had a spiritual awakening. The third part is practice these principles in all our affairs. If those two things are manifest in our lives, to the extent that they are manifest in our lives, we can't not do the middle part. We can't not carry the message. And our carrying the message is, again, to use your phrase, the fact that we're living a sober life. And it makes people hungry.
I'm aware that that one of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous is that they're what is the language about promotion?
Attraction, not promotion.
Attraction rather than promotion.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
That merely by living in this manner, we are carrying the message.
Well, this was, I think, precisely how AA got started, because I think we touched on this, but in the very beginning, when Bill W. came out to Ohio, and it was just after he'd spent 6 months trying to promote sobriety, and without succeeding in helping one person get sober. And then he had a conversation with Dr. Silkworth, who said, you know, don't be such a promoter, tell your story. And so that's exactly what Bill did with Dr. Bob, who initially said he was a busy man and didn't have much time to spend. And they ended up talking way into the night. And the reason was because Dr. Bob was drawn to, I think, to Bill's manifestation of sobriety in his being. And he wasn't being persuaded by logic. He wasn't being persuaded by threat of consequences. He was disciplined, if you will, by the enticing image of the man in front of him. And I use that word disciplined because of the fact that the word discipline became detoxified for me when I noticed the word disciple. And I realized that that's the most powerful discipline of all, the discipline that we invite ourselves to exercise when we are disciples of something that lifts our spirit and beckons to us and says, you know, come this way. And
there's that word admitting again.
And here's fulfillment.
Yeah.
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 It's the step says to practice these principles in all our affairs, and it doesn't go into precisely what those principles are. But I think in a previous discussion off camera, you kind of illuminated that they are to be withdrawn from the experience of going through this process. Right.
The principles in the broad sense are the steps themselves.
Yes.
But I think I shared with you in my first writings, for example, in the Alcoholic Earth paper that people can find on my website, The Earth is an Alcoholic, the principles are boiled down to surrender control and accept responsibility. And in later writings, I broaden that to surrender control, accept responsibility, and practice indiscriminate compassion. I was very pleased with that, to be honest. And then brought up short when it dawned on me that those very sentiments and concepts have been expressed by Dr. Bob himself, except much more simply, succinctly, and accessibly in the phrase, trust God, clean house, help others.
Excellent. I love it. Thank you. That's where we'll pick it up next time, Roget.
Splendid.
And broaden this discussion a bit and perhaps get to what you were talking about, alluding to earlier in the Alcoholic Earth.
Look forward to it.
So thank you for coming. And
my pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on Come to Think of It. I hope you'll be with us next time. Until then, drive cheerfully. I'm Casey Scott.